Okay, so hopefully we've had a really good discussion on what fundamental movement skills are. Now, I've listed on the board here a number of fundamental movement skills that I believe young children should be competent in, or what we call mastery in, by the time they leave primary school. And the reason being is when a young child gets to secondary school, we expect them to be able to play sport. We expect them to be able to play badminton and tennis and basketball and rugby and football. And yet, many of the movement skills that are required to play those sports, they haven't gained what we call mastery in, or they're not competent in those movements. And as I've said in previous weeks, if they're not competent in doing something, it has a knock-on effect on a young child's self-esteem, their confidence, and their motivation to participate. And if they haven't got that self-esteem, they haven't got that willingness to participate and that confidence to participate or motivation, then they are not going to engage in physical activity. And maybe that is what contributes to the drop-off in young children that we see at 13 and 14 years of age in secondary school. So for me, it's about, at a young age, not necessarily just primary school, but also the early years of secondary school, it's making sure children have got what we call mastery or competent in these basic fundamental movement skills. So these are some that I have come up with. Hopefully you have come up with many more. I think there's probably about 40 different fundamental movement skills that we would expect young children to be competent in or mastery in by the time they leave primary school at 11 or 12 years of age. Now obviously between the ages of sort of when they're born, some are more relevant to when they're born. So skills like climbing and crawling and grabbing and squeezing, they are basic motor skills or fundamental skills that are relevant to young children. As young children get older and they approach key stage 2, so 7 to 11 years of age, then things like running, jumping, catching and throwing become more relevant and more important to their everyday physical activity and everyday lives. Now the issue that I've got is we almost presume that young children can do all of this. We naturally think children are born with these movement skills and they are competent in these movement skills. However, it's not something that a young child necessarily learns. And you think back to your own experiences in primary and secondary school. How many of you were actually taught to throw a ball, to catch a ball, even how to run properly? I bet none of us were taught that. It was something that the teacher, your parents, your coaches, it was something that we almost think people naturally just develop it. And the problem is those that don't become competent or gain mastery in these movement skills, they progress through life, they progress into secondary school, and they haven't got that competency. And it has a significant impact on not only sporting performance or physical education, but lifelong physical activity. Okay, so for task 2, what I would like you to do for this task is don't throw away what we've just done for the previous task, all of those fundamental movement skills you've identified. Maybe what you can do before we start this task is to get everyone's within the group or everyone within the class, get all of the fundamental movement skills and put them on one piece of flip chart paper at the front of the class, so that you've taken everyone's ideas now, and so you've got all of the fundamental movement skills that you've come up with, plus any of mine that you didn't have. So you should have at least between, I'd say at least 25 to 30 different fundamental movement skills. Now, what I would like you to do now is, firstly, can you identify the categories that fundamental movement skills fall into? So there are 3 categories that fundamental movement skills fall into. And once we've identified those 3 categories, what I would like you to do is all of the fundamental movement skills you came up with, can you identify where those fundamental movement skills actually go into? So what category do the fundamental movement skills go into? So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to try and think of the 3 categories that fundamental movement skills fall into. I'll give you a clue. If you think of the type of movements of each of those fundamental movement skills, it might give you an idea of the category that they would fall into. Okay, so hopefully you've come up with those categories, and by looking at the fundamental movement skills, it should give you a really good idea in terms of what category those fundamental movement skills come into. So if you didn't come up with them, the three categories that exist to distinguish and separate fundamental movement skills are locomotor skills, manipulative skills, and what we call non-locomotor or stability skills. And as their definition suggests, a locomotor skill is any movement skill which involves some form of movement. So I'll give you some starters for each, and then what I would like you to do is to categorize those movements. So for example, run or running would come under a locomotor skill. Now, a manipulative skill is a movement skill which involves manipulation of an object or an implement. So for example, if you are catching a ball, you are manipulating an object. So anything which involves manipulating an object or an implement would come under a manipulative skill. Non-locomotor or stability skills, as it suggests, are fundamental movement skills that don't involve any locomotion or movement or with the body in a stable position. So if you can take all of the fundamental movement skills that your group or class have identified, and now what we're going to do is we're going to spend 15 minutes on this task, and what I would like you to do is within these three categories, where do you think the fundamental movement skills that you came up with would actually sit?